The supper table held 22 places, and Dorothy Vane had counted them all. She stood at the sideboard, her back to the room, her gloved hands resting on the cool edge of the silver tray, and she did not look at what she had brought with her in the small folded paper tucked inside her left glove. She did not need to look. She had been aware of it against her wrist for 3 hours, the way one is aware of a wound that has not yet begun to hurt, present, certain, and not yet real. The room was brilliant. 22 candles on the central candelabra alone, and the silver plate on the table caught their light and threw it back in small bright coins across the plasterwork ceiling. The Ashburn dining room was everything money and 2 centuries of taste could arrange, and the guests arriving through the double doors at the far end were dressed to match it: pearls, silk and amber and ivory. The careful laughter of people who had nothing to fear from this evening. At the head of the table, not yet seated, Edward Hargreave, Viscount Ashburn, stood with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into the expression of a man who had somewhere better to be. He was tall. That was the first thing she had noticed about him 3 days ago when she arrived at the house, and it was still the first thing she noticed now. Tall and contained and radiating a cold that was not unfriendliness so much as the complete absence of any effort to be otherwise. Across the room, Lady Winifred Astay, Sh. Beer caught Dorothy's eye and gave a single, slow nod. 2 cups. The crystal one nearest to Lady Cecilia's place, the smaller pewter one, set slightly to the right, for the toast. Dorothy's hand moved toward the tray, and then she stopped. She had not known she would stop. She had been so certain, all through the long afternoon, that she would simply do what she had agreed to do, because women in her position did not have the luxury of principles they could not afford. She had told herself this on the coach from her lodgings. She had told herself this while arranging the place cards. She had told herself this 6 times since the footman brought the wine. Her hand rested on the smaller cup. She did not pour. She picked it up, set it down on the other side. The crystal cup was now where the pewter cup had been, and the pewter cup sat harmless and empty an inch from where the footman would fill it, and the folded paper inside her glove pressed against her wrist, and she thought, there is no undoing this. She was right. 3 weeks before the betrothal supper, Dorothy Vane had £4 and 11 shillings to her name. This was the accounting she made each morning at her writing desk in the room she hired from Mrs. Mendry. Tanner in Clements Lane, a room whose window looked onto a wall and whose chimney smoked when the wind was from the north. Her father had been a country solicitor of modest reputation and considerable optimism, and when he died in the autumn of 1813, he left behind a desk full of letters and a set of accounts that made clear the optimism had carried him rather further than the reputation. His debts were not enormous, they were merely, as the creditor's solicitor phrased it, with notable gentleness, greater than his estate. Dorothy had sold what there was to sell, the furniture, the horse, 2 of her mother's rings, and had come to London because London was where companions were hired, and she was precisely the kind of woman who got hired as one. She was educated. She read French and had a serviceable Italian, and she had kept her father's household for 3 years while he failed to keep it himself, which meant she could manage a budget and a menu and the complicated social machinery of a house in which the money was insufficient, but the standards were not. She was the sort of woman employers described as capable, which was the word they used when they meant useful, without being threatening. She had been 3 months with Mrs. Bopley, Pendleton in Marylebone, and 2 months with Lady Quincy in Portman Square. Before the letter came, it was delivered by a woman she did not know, in a hired carriage, and it contained an offer of employment of an unusual kind. The author of the letter did not name herself directly. She described herself as a person of consequence with an interest in a domestic arrangement that required careful management, and she indicated that a young woman of good sense and no particular attachments would be generously compensated for a short engagement requiring a small specific service at a private supper. The compensation named was more than Dorothy had earned in the previous 6 months combined. She told herself she would simply hear the terms. She told herself she was not agreeing to anything. She told herself that a woman with £4.11 was not in a position to turn away before she had heard what was being asked. The meeting took place in a house in Curzon Street, in a drawing room that Dorothy recognized instantly as belonging to someone who had never in her life sat in a rented room watching a chimney smoke. The woman who received her had silver hair, dressed in an elaborate updo with pearl pins, and pale blue eyes of the kind that assessed the value of everything they rested on. She was 60 or thereabouts, upright in the manner of a woman who has spent decades sitting in judgment and considers the posture its own reward. She wore midnight blue silk and a pearl choker, and held a black lace fan closed in her left hand as one might hold a scepter. She said, "You are merely the paid companion. No one will look at you. That is precisely why I have asked you here." Her name, Dorothy learned within the first 5 minutes, was Lady Winifred Ashburn. Her son was Edward Hargreave, Viscount Ashburn. He was contracted to be engaged at a private betrothal supper in 11 days to Lady Cecilia Prentice, daughter of Viscount Prentice of Hampshire. Lady Winifred did not consider this an adequate match. She had a preferable candidate. Miss Arabella Foyle, daughter of the Earl of Foyle, whose family connection and fortune would constitute a materially superior arrangement. The supper could not proceed as planned. Lady Cecilia was to toast with a cup of wine. Something placed in the wine, something Lady Winifred would provide. In a small paper packet would cause Lady Cecilia to become unwell. Not seriously. Lady Winifred was at pains to emphasize this. An hour of discomfort, perhaps 2. Enough to create concern. Enough to require her removal from the table. The supper would be disrupted, the betrothal announcement would be delayed. And in the delay, alternatives could be arranged. Dorothy sat very still while this was explained to her. She said, "You wish me to introduce a substance into Lady Cecilia's wine." Lady Winifred said, "I wish you to assist with a domestic inconvenience. You will be placed in the household as a companion to one of the other guests. No one will think twice about you. You will manage the arrangement during the service of the wine. You will be gone before the evening is over." The packet would be left in an envelope on Dorothy's chair at the supper table. The compensation, once the service was complete, would be left in a second envelope with her name on it in the drawing room at Curzon Street. Dorothy said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days. She did not sleep well on either night. She looked at her £4.11 on the morning of the 3rd day and accepted the commission, because she had told herself enough times by then that it was not really harm, it was only discomfort. It was not really her fault, it was only a service. It was not really her conscience at issue because a woman in her position had no standing from which conscience could operate with any practical effect. She was wrong about this, as it turned out. Ashburn House in Grosvenor Square was nothing like Clements Lane, which Dorothy recognized was so obvious a fact as to be barely worth noting, and yet it was the first thing she felt when the carriage set her down at the front steps. The house was large, that is to say, it was London large, which meant it occupied a breadth and height that enforced a particular relationship between the person entering it and the person they had been before they entered. Dorothy had been in large houses before. She had worked in large houses. She had learned how to move through them with the brisk invisibility that service required. She had never stood at the foot of a flight of steps and felt the house looking back. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pryor, met her in the entrance hall. She was a woman of 50 or so, with a face like a considered opinion and the economy of movement that long service produces. She said the companion's room was on the 2nd floor, said supper was at 8, and said if Miss Vane required anything she was to ring for the upstairs maid, and not to bother the house staff in the kitchens during preparation. She said all of this while looking at Dorothy with the steady perception of a woman who had spent 30 years reading the state of a household and its people. And Dorothy had the unsettling feeling that Mrs. Hal Pryor was reading something in her that she herself had not yet located. "You look pale," Mrs. Pryor said, which was a statement rather than a question. "I am well," Dorothy said, which was not precisely an answer. She was shown to her room, and left alone with the small traveling bag that held everything she owned that was worth traveling with. And she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and thought about £4 and 11 shillings, and whether the amount would look different if she had earned it differently. In the 2 days between her arrival and the supper, Dorothy learned the particular geography of a house that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The Viscount's father had been dead for 5 years, and the house still carried the quiet argument between the era of his occupancy and whatever era his son would eventually impose upon it. The study was the son's, precise and uncluttered, the desk clear, the books arranged as tools rather than ornament. The drawing room was the mother's, a room designed to be seen in every surface, an occasion for display, the chairs arranged not for comfort but for audience. The dining room was contested territory, bearing the long mahogany table of the previous generation, and above the fireplace a painting of the house in its Derbyshire setting, that both of them seemed to pass without looking at. Dorothy moved through these rooms with the intention of being invisible, which she had always been good at. She helped the parlor maid with the morning room. She carried messages between Mrs. Tay. Prior in the kitchen she was present when wanted, and absent when not. And she watched him with the care of someone who has reason to want to know a person before that person has reason to notice them. She had braced herself for something closer to the imperious, something that would make what she had agreed to do easier to contemplate. He was not that. He was simply self-contained in a way that left very little space for other people to enter. And the coldness everyone in the house seemed to attribute to him was not, Dorothy thought, coldness at all. It was distance. The careful distance of a man who has decided not to be where he cannot be reached. She watched him once cross the entrance hall and stop, when one of the junior footmen dropped a tray of letters. He said nothing. He waited while the footman collected the letters, then bent and picked up the one that had slid farthest and handed it back and walked on. No acknowledgement, no reproof. It was the act of someone who has decided that small courtesies are simply things one does, without attribution, without requiring the other person to feel grateful for them, which was a kind of discipline Dorothy had not expected to find instructive and did. She thought about this later. She thought about it while the folded paper sat inside her glove. She had not yet changed for supper when she heard a sound she was not expecting. Laughter. Light, unguarded. The laughter of someone who does not know they are being heard. Then, singing. A young woman's voice, clear and not trained, picking out a simple melody in the room beyond the wall, the room that had been identified as the retiring room for the ladies during the supper. Lady Cecilia Prentice, not yet 22, not yet formally announced as anyone's betrothed, alone in a room before the most consequential evening of her young life, and singing to herself the way people sing when they are nervous, and there is no one to witness the nerves. Dorothy sat on the edge of her bed and listened. She did not know what she had expected Lady Cecilia to be. Something less real. Something easier to hold at arm's length. A title, perhaps, rather than a voice. Yet the voice went on, soft and imperfect and entirely human. And Dorothy pressed her gloved hand against her sternum and understood that she was going to have a great deal of difficulty with the next several hours. She had not intended to go into the portrait gallery. The east corridor connected the dining room to the main staircase, and Dorothy had gone down it to verify the arrangement of the sideboard before the guests arrived, and the gallery was simply a room she passed with its door standing slightly open, which was not itself an invitation to enter. Yet she heard the sound of something set down on a surface, deliberately, in the silence of a room that was otherwise empty, and she paused at the threshold. The room was long and lit by a pair of wall candles near the far end, and it smelled of beeswax and old wood. The portraits ran in 2 rows along both walls, and in front of the second-to-last portrait on the left, Edward Hargreave, Viscount Ashburn, stood alone. He was looking at a small oval portrait at eye height. He stood with his hands clasped at his back and his face toward the canvas. And after a moment, he reached up and turned the portrait to face the wall. He had not heard her. She was entirely certain of that because his face in that moment was the face of a man who believed himself private, and it was nothing like the face he wore in company. It was not cold. It was not contained. It was the face of a man sitting with something heavy, in the way one sits with grief, that has aged past its first pain into something quieter and more permanent. He turned, saw her, and his face arranged itself back into its usual precise blankness, with an efficiency that told her exactly how much practice had gone into it. She said the first thing that came to her, which was the honest thing. "Forgive me." The door was open. He looked at her for a moment. "You are the companion," he said. "I am Miss Vane." "Yes." He seemed to take the distinction without objection. "The guests begin arriving in 20 minutes, he said. That was all. He walked past her, and the gallery was empty. And Dorothy stood alone, looking at the portrait turned to face the wall. She did not turn it back. Yet she thought about what she had seen in his face. She thought about it for the rest of the evening, and she was thinking about it when she stood at the sideboard with her hand on the pewter cup, and Lady Winifred Ashburn caught her eye across the room and gave the nod. She was thinking about a man who had turned something to face the wall so he would not have to look at it, and who had dressed his face into armor before he crossed a threshold, and who was spending an evening among 30 guests, and no one, as far as Dorothy could tell, had noticed that anything about this evening cost him anything at all. She was thinking that some people were not looked at even when they were in plain sight. She switched the cups. The supper lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. Dorothy counted the courses and drank nothing, and kept her hands folded in her lap whenever she was not required to move, which was most of the time, because a companion seated at the far end of the table near the serving staff has very little occasion to be otherwise occupied. She watched Lady Cecilia, who sat at the center of the table in a rose-colored gown, and laughed at something the man beside her said, and who drank her wine with the easy grace of someone who did not know how close the evening had come to ending differently. She watched Miss Arabella Foyle, who sat 3 places to the right of Edward, who was ivory silk and amber eyes, and the expression of a woman who had been told so many times she was the most beautiful person in any room she entered, that she had begun to believe it constituted a personality. She watched Lady Winifred, who was watching the table, who was watching Dorothy, whose pale blue gaze moved from the pewter cup to Dorothy's face, and back to the pewter cup over the first 30 minutes with an increasing concentration that began, Dorothy understood, to shade from expectation into something more careful. The room glittered. That was the only word for it. The candelabra on the table threw amber light across 22 faces and 22 sets of silver plate, and the crystal of 22 wineglasses, and the effect was of a world that had arranged itself entirely for its own pleasure, and could not conceive of the existence of a world that had not. The guests were the kind of people who occupied these rooms naturally, for whom the hum of 24 conversations at a long table was the ordinary music of existence. Dorothy had been in rooms like this as a child, when her father still entertained, when the house on the edge of Hertfordshire had still had candles on the good table and the good china on display. She had sat then as the daughter of the house, not as the woman, at the far end by the sideboard, and the difference was its own education. Arabella leaned toward the woman seated next to her during the second course, and Dorothy heard, quite distinctly, because voices carry in rooms that are otherwise well managed, "Is that not merely the paid companion at the end of the table?" She said it the way one might observe a piece of furniture that had been placed in an odd location, with mild curiosity and no particular interest in the answer. The woman beside her murmured something agreeable, and they returned their attention to the plate before them, and that was the whole of it. Dorothy looked at the pewter cup. She thought about the woman who had hired her, and whether that woman would recall her name in a fortnight, and concluded she would not. She watched Edward. He sat at the head of the table and spoke when spoken to, and laughed once, briefly, at something Lord Prentice said about the autumn hunting, and otherwise maintained the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he has decided to endure. He looked down the table 3 times in the first hour. Dorothy was not certain what he was looking at. She was almost certain it was not her. She was wrong about this. After the toast, after the glasses were raised, and the betrothal contract was signed in the study, and the guests had moved to the drawing-room for tea, and the evening wound toward its end, Dorothy found herself in the East Passage collecting her hat and her gloves from the small room off the hall where she had left them. And the passage was empty except for one lamp burning low. And Edward Hargreave was at the far end of it. He said, "Miss Vane." She stopped. He walked toward her, and stopped 2 feet away, and in the dim light his face had something of the same quality it had held in the portrait gallery. Not the public blankness, but the thing underneath it. He had removed his gloves. She noticed this because it was the first time she had seen his hands ungloved, and they were the hands of a man who worked at something when he was not performing the function of a viscount, the particular set of the fingers, the way they held themselves at his sides. "I watched you," he said, "for the better part of 2 hours." Her chest was very still. "I was not aware I was of particular interest." "You are not as a rule," he said, which was not unkind, merely accurate. "But you did not eat, and you did not drink, and your hands shook throughout the second course, and at the moment of the toast, you held your breath and did not release it until Lady Cecilia had finished her glass." He paused. "I would like to know why." She could have said a dozen things. She had rehearsed nothing for this, because she had never imagined it would be necessary. She had imagined she would do what she had been paid to do, or not do it, and either way she would leave before anyone thought to ask. She had not imagined anyone would be watching her closely enough to notice what her hands had done. The lamp at the end of the passage burned low. It threw a light that was amber and unsteady, and in it Edward's face was patient still and waiting. She said, "I was asked to put something in Lady Cecilia's cup." The passage was very quiet. "I did not do it," she said. "I had already placed it in the other cup when I changed my mind. I switched them." Lady Cecilia drank from the cup that was clean. She held herself straight, because she had learned long ago that the body's posture was the only thing one could control in a moment when everything else had escaped control. The powder is wrapped in its paper on the windowsill in the servants' hall. "I did not destroy it. I did not know what I should do with it." He was entirely still. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of response, but the management of a great deal of it. She watched his jaw set and release and set again, the only indication of the calculation occurring behind his eyes. "Who asked you?" he said. She thought of the house on Curzon Street, the midnight blue silk, the pearl choker. She thought of what she had told herself about principles and position, and what a woman with £4 and 11 shillings could afford to believe about herself. "Your mother," she said. Morning came to Ashburn House with a particular grey quality of London in early February, and Dorothy sat in her room and waited for whatever came next, because she had no plan for what came next and never had. She had slept 2 hours. She knew this, because she had been awake when the church bell on the corner rang 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, and then she had fallen into a shallow grey doze from which she emerged feeling that she had not slept at all. The fire in her room had died. She did not relight it. She sat in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap and the very faint light of a February dawn doing almost nothing to the sky outside, and she thought about what she had done and what it had cost, and found to her considerable surprise that the accounting came out rather differently than she had expected. She had lost the compensation, this was certain. She had nothing to show for the weeks since the letter from Lady Winifred, except the fraying of the story she had been telling herself about why women in her position could not afford to have principles. That story had collapsed in a candlelit dining room over a pewter cup, and what had replaced it was not comfort, exactly, but something more durable. She had held the cup. She had made a choice. The choice had been visible to someone who had watched her make it. She thought of £4 and 11 shillings. She thought that was not the number that mattered now. Mrs. Pryor came at 7:30 with a tray. She set it on the table by the window without comment, and Dorothy looked at the tea and the bread and the preserves, and thought that this was an act of some specificity, because Mrs. Pryor had not been asked to bring a tray, and had brought one anyway. "He has sent for the solicitor," Mrs. Pryor said. "Mr. Selden will arrive at 10, Dorothy said. "I see," Mrs. Pryor looked at her with the same reading expression she had worn at their first meeting. "You are still pale," she said. "I have not slept a great deal." "No," Mrs. Pryor said. "I thought not." She moved toward the door. "Eat something," she said, which was a command, and underneath it was something that was not quite kindness and not quite pity, but was warmer than either. And Dorothy found she was grateful for it in a way she could not easily have named. She had told him everything. The letter, the meeting, the packet, the compensation promised. She had told him about the powder, which she had removed from the cup and folded back into its paper and placed on the windowsill of the servants' hall where anyone might have left it. She had told him that she had needed the money and had convinced herself it would not be serious harm, and had been wrong in the convincing. He had listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "You will remain in this house until tomorrow." She said, "I have no right to ask for anything," he said. "I did not ask you what you had a right to ask for." He walked to the end of the passage and then back. "Stay," he said, which was one word, and the word was a command, and underneath the command was something she could not name and did not try to. She stayed. At 10 in the morning, Mr. Selden arrived. He was a compact man in his 50s, with the face of someone who had been asked many difficult questions in the course of his career, and had developed a professional equanimity about all of them. He had been summoned by Edward before breakfast, and he arrived to find the household gathered, not the full company of the previous evening, but the essential persons. Lady Winifred, whose expression when she entered had already done considerable reckoning Arabella, who had not yet departed and who stood near the window with her amber eyes gone wary, Lord and Lady Prentice, who had been sent for by note at 7 in the morning, Lady Cecilia, still in her morning dress, whose expression had moved from confusion to something quieter and more serious as the hour advanced. Pryor, standing at the back. Dorothy stood beside Edward, which was not where she would have placed herself, but he had said, "Stand here," and she had. Lady Winifred recognized the configuration before anyone spoke. She sat very upright in the chair she had taken by the fireplace, and the pearl choker caught the morning light, and her pale blue eyes had the fixed quality of a person who is rapidly calculating the distance between where they are and where they need to be. "My son," she said, "this is entirely unnecessary. Whatever this young woman has told you, I would like to hear it directly, Mr. Gree." Selden said mildly, in the manner of a man who had been there long enough to know when mildness was more effective than force. Dorothy told it again. The same account she had given in the passage the night before, in the same order, without embellishment. She held her hands still in her lap and spoke in the register that years of service had taught her. Clear, composed, no more feeling in the voice than was necessary to communicate the relevant facts. When she finished, Lady Winifred drew herself up. The fan was not in her hand, but she held herself as though it were. "She is merely the paid companion," Lady Winifred said. Her voice was controlled, but underneath the control was the edge of a woman who has spent decades arranging things, and is discovering that something has been unarranged without her knowledge. Her word counts for nothing. She was engaged for a task, and she is now attempting to place the blame for her own dishonesty onto this family. A woman of no means and no character is not a credible witness to. Miss Vane acted with more honor than anyone in this room. It was Edward who said it. Not loudly. Not in the raised voice of a man making a speech. In the level, precise, unhurried voice of a man who has thought about a thing and arrived at its end, and is stating the conclusion because the conclusion is true. 11 words. He said them once and did not repeat them. The room was very still. Lady Winifred said nothing. For the first time in the 2 hours Dorothy had watched her this morning, she said nothing at all. The fan was not in her hand. Her mouth opened and then closed again. Beside the window, Arabella set her eyes on the floor. Mr. Selden looked at his documents. Lord Prentice looked at his wife. Lady Cecilia looked at Dorothy, and what was in her face was not anger. It was something more considered than that, and more difficult to look at. Edward said, to no one in particular, "My mother will be returning to Curzon Street this morning." He did not look at Lady Winifred while he said it. "Mr. Selden, I would ask you to attend to the relevant arrangements and to confirm for Lord and Lady Prentice that the terms of the betrothal contract are unaffected by last evening's events." Mr. Selden said he would see to it. Lady Winifred left the room with Mrs. Pryor at her elbow and said nothing further, and that was itself a kind of accounting. 3 days later, Lord Prentice called. He was a broad, plain-spoken man who had the look of someone perpetually surprised to find himself in London when there was countryside available, and he sat in Edward's study for 40 minutes, and then Dorothy learned from Mrs. Sogg. Pryor emerged and asked to speak to her. She went to the study, which she had not previously entered, and Lord Prentice was standing by the window, and Edward was behind the desk, and both of them looked at her with the careful regard of men who have just agreed on something and are not certain how she will receive it. Lord Prentice said, "My daughter is alive and well, and her betrothal stands, and that is entirely owing to you." "I nearly did the opposite," Dorothy said. "You did not," he said, which was the whole of the argument. So far as he was concerned, he had, he explained, already spoken to Lady Cecilia, and Lady Cecilia had been told the full account. Lord Prentice pressed his hands together. "I would like to offer you a position in my household," he said, "as a companion to my daughter formerly engaged, at a proper salary for as long as you are willing to serve. She would like you. She asked me to say so." Dorothy thought of the voice through the wall, the singing unguarded in a room the singer believed was empty. She said, "I am grateful. I would ask a day to think on it." Lord Prentice nodded and left, and the room had only her and Edward in it, and the fire and the quiet particular to a house that has just expelled the source of its unease. Edward looked at the desk surface for a moment. Then he said, "It is a good offer. Yes, you would be well situated." "I know it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You told me you agreed to it, because you had no standing from which conscience could operate practically." He did not look at her while he said this. His eyes were on the fire. "I have thought about that." She waited. "I have thought," he said, carefully, "that it is a peculiar thing to believe. That a person's standing determines whether their conscience has weight." He paused. "I have spent a considerable portion of the past several years believing something similar. That the feelings one has, if they are not undergirded by sufficient arrangement, by sufficient rank or contract or practical architecture, are therefore not reliable enough to act on." The fire shifted. He looked at it. "I have found evidence recently that this is also wrong." Dorothy said, "You turned a portrait to the wall." He looked up. "In the gallery," she said, "the evening before the supper. I did not mean to see it." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Clara Whitmore. She is Lady Sedley now." He said the name as though it were the name of a weather event, something noted rather than felt. "I was 26. I believed myself to be the kind of man who was loved." A pause. "I concluded I was not that kind of man. And now," she said. He looked at her gray eyes, wide and steady, and the fine vertical line at his left brow that she had first noticed in the entrance hall 3 days ago. "I find the conclusion is under revision," he said. It was not a declaration. It was too careful for that, too measured. The word of a man who has trained himself to mean exactly, and only what he says. Yet underneath it was what she had heard in the passage the night of the supper, when he said, "Stay." And what she had heard in the morning room when he said her name like it was something he had been holding in his mouth for a moment before releasing it. The thing that lived under the precision, patient and warm and not quite ready, yet to be stated plainly. She thought of £4 and 11 shillings, and of a woman who had told herself she did not matter enough to have principles. She thought of a cup switched in candlelight, the simplest act, the most costly thing she had ever done. She said, "I will give Lord Prentice my answer tomorrow." She paused. "I believe I shall accept." He said, "Yes." A pause, and then, "Cecilia is fortunate." She sang, Dorothy said, which explained nothing and everything. She did not know I could hear her. He looked at her steadily. I know the feeling, he said. If you have stayed with Dorothy this far, leave a word in the quiet. What she did in that candlelit moment stays with me too. Spring arrived late that year, but it arrived thoroughly. The way spring comes in London when the winter has held on long enough to be resented, a sudden all-at-once quality to the warmth that made people stop on pavements and look up. The Ashbourne Gardens in Grosvenor Square were not large, but they were well ordered, and in the first week of April they had the look of a project that had finally been given permission to proceed. Dorothy had been with the Prentice household for 6 weeks. Lady Cecilia was everything the singing had implied. She was not particularly complicated, and not particularly simple and thoroughly herself in a way that required no performance and gave no apology. She had asked Dorothy once, very directly, whether she had been frightened on the night of the supper. Dorothy had said yes. Cecilia had said that she supposed it must have required a great deal of something to switch those cups, and Dorothy had said she was not certain it had required anything admirable, only that she had found she could not do otherwise. Cecilia had looked at her for a long moment and said, I think that is the most admirable kind of thing there is. She had not seen Edward since the morning in his study. He had sent a note, 3 weeks after she entered the Prentice household, on a plain card with his name at the bottom and 2 lines of text. The note said that Lord Prentice's solicitor had confirmed the betrothal arrangement was in good order, and that he hoped she was well settled. It was precisely the sort of note a man writes when he has a great deal he could say, and has decided not to say it yet. She was in the Prentice garden, on the afternoon of the 7th of April, helping Lady Cecilia with a small catalogue of the spring bulbs she had developed an interest in preserving in watercolor, when Mrs. Sagan T. Pryor appeared at the garden gate. Dorothy said, Mrs. Pryor. She had not expected to see the Ashbourne housekeeper here. Mrs. Pryor said, The Viscount's compliments, Miss Vane. He asks whether you have a quarter of an hour. She held a small object in her hand wrapped in a square of linen. He sends this in advance. Dorothy took the linen square. Inside it was a small pewter cup. She looked at it for a long moment. The cup was ordinary in every objective particular. It was the kind of cup that ends up at the far end of a table, the lesser of the pair, the one no one looks at. She had not thought about where it had gone after the supper. She had not thought about anyone keeping it. She looked up. Edward was at the garden gate behind Mrs. Cofer. Pryor, in his navy coat, and his face had the expression it wore when he was attempting not to betray himself, which was the only expression she had ever seen him wear that told her precisely how he felt. Lady Cecilia, behind her, said something in a low voice to the maid about the tulip bulbs. Dorothy walked to the gate. She said, You kept it. I thought someone should, he said. She held the cup in both hands, the cool pewter warming against her palms. Around them the garden had that first week of April quality, the smell of earth and the sound of birds going about their business, with the purposeful energy of creatures who have waited long enough. Edward's gray eyes were steady on her face. The fine line at his left brow caught the afternoon light. You said the conclusion was under revision, she said. Yes. Have you reached a revised conclusion? He said, I find that I have a great deal of standing from which my conscience might operate, and that the primary direction it is operating in is the question of whether you would do me the considerable honor of allowing me to speak to Lord Prentice on a particular matter at his earliest convenience. It was a long way to say one thing. She understood that this was his manner, this precise and careful accounting that arrived at its point the way a legal argument arrives at its conclusion, step by certain step, so that when it lands there is no way to pretend it has not. She said, I think Lord Prentice is at home this afternoon. The garden was very quiet. From the house behind them came the faint sound of Cecilia talking to the maid about whether a particular yellow tulip qualified as gold or as merely yellow, which was the kind of thing Cecilia cared about, with a seriousness Dorothy had come to find deeply charming. Edward reached out and closed his hand over hers, both of his hands around both of hers and the small pewter cup between them, and he held there for a moment, not moving, the way a person holds something they have decided to keep. The spring light fell across the gray stones of the garden path. The cup was warm now, the metal having taken the heat of her hands, and it was nothing, really. Nothing but a small and ordinary object from the lesser end of a dining table, the kind of thing that no one looks at. She had looked at it. She had held it in a candlelit room and made the only decision that had ever made her feel like herself. And the man in front of her had kept it for 6 weeks in the knowledge that she would one day come back to the gate. He said quietly, Dorothy, her given name, in his voice for the first time. The sun was on his face. He looked, she thought, like a man who had decided to stop facing portraits toward the wall. She kept the cup,